So my name is Pluto Liu, and I'm from the University of Otago. So today I will be talking about a lot about kelp and if they will establish in Antarctica one day. But before I go into the main talk, I just wanted to introduce a little bit of background information of myself, because when I signed up for the conference, I was supposed to start my PhD project as soon as possible, which was pretty much months ago now, but unfortunately, because of a lot of reasons, I still haven't started yet. So this talk will mostly about basically some preliminary research done by my supervisor and collaborators, and it's quite simplified version of their job. And how this leads into this PhD project and why we are doing this. Right, and please no hard questions because I haven't started yet. So Antarctica, it's basically a huge landmass covered by ice and surrounded by the big, wide open Southern Ocean. Because the ocean is so big and wide, there's very drastic temperature change from north to the south. And also there's very strong westerlies blowing all around the ocean. So this kind of contributes to the very strong currents and fronts around the Southern Ocean, including the ACC, kind of top, the Antarctic circumpolar currents, and the Antarctic polar front, also just kind of the bottom front. So this kind of creating a barrier preventing species moving around. There's little or almost no evidence basically showing there's organisms migrating from north to the south to Antarctica since the last glacial maximum. And most of the species, including terrestrial and marine species in Antarctica, they are endemic and they have evolved there for millions of years. However, I think in the recent years, in the past decades, there's more and more reporting of exotic species found in Antarctica, but they are mostly from human introductions, like boats, or just humans being on the land, so research ships or tourism. So they bring a lot of things with them. So there's actually an interesting paper just kind of published about how the shipping traffic, which Mark and Rob kind of also talk about, the connectivity, how the shipping connects all around the world, and Antarctica is definitely one of them. So again, it's not many natural migration from the north to the south. And Antarctica is basically an isolated land, both physically and ecologically. At least we thought so. But in 2017, in January, so one of the collaborators, they found some beached kelp in one of the Antarctic coasts in the quite northern parts of Antarctica, which is interesting because obviously they are not native species of Antarctica. They are usually found around the temperate cold regions, like there's a lot around New Zealand, or sub-Antarctic islands. So these species are Duvelia, Antarctica, or Rimarapa. They are very abundant around New Zealand and temperate regions, but definitely not Antarctica. And obviously they are most likely not from human introductions, because no one's gonna bring kelp to Antarctica on a boat. So it comes to the question, like, where do they come from naturally? So they managed to collect 2 kelp samples from the beach, and they combined it with some other established populations around the Southern Ocean islands, and they did a population genomic analysis, and here's the results. So they did the genotyping-by-sequencing and generated over 15,000 SNPs. So this is the unrooted phylogenetic tree of the kelp populations around the Southern Ocean, and the 2 little stars is the beached Antarctic kelp. And we can see one is grouped with the South Georgia, which is at the bottom of that little star there, the yellow lines, and then one is grouped with Kerguelen Island, which is more at the left side of the map. And so we basically think the barrier which we thought is unbreakable, obviously kelp can kind of float across them, and this is how we think they might float all the way thousands of kilometers and reach Antarctica tip. Because of this, they also did more sampling after the paper published. And for this time, they also generated a draft genome of the Duvilia species, so increased the accuracy a little bit more. And this time they generated over 200,000 SNPs for this study. And again, we can see all the Antarctic samples, the yellow stars. They come from South Georgia, they come from Mariana Islands, so all kinds of sub-Antarctic islands. And further to this, we can also see some connectivities between the sub-Antarctic islands. For example, if you can see the New Zealand, the blue stars, New Zealand beached kelp, they might be coming from South Georgia, or they might be coming from the Mariana Island, which is one sample just at the top. So there's actually a very strong connectivity around the Southern Ocean, like the kelp just float all around them and from one end to another and connecting all the land together, instead of like we think the ocean's just a big ocean and nothing happening much there. So the colleagues, they also did some oceanographic modeling. They did some dispersal model with stock strips and eddies, so they simulated some particles, virtual particles, released from different sub-Antarctic islands. So this graph only shows the South Georgia, which is the red dots there. And they released millions of particles, virtual particles from the islands, and to see where they ended up over a 3-year period. And all the blue lines are those ones that reached Antarctica eventually, and all the yellow or orange lines are those particles that didn't reach Antarctica eventually. So the particles that reached Antarctica only made up less than 1% of the total amount of particles, but the idea here is like they can break the barrier and reach that, and it's only simulated over a 3-year period, so kelp has been there for millions of years, so the frequency of them reaching Antarctica might be much more frequent and much more often than we thought so. They kind of also, there's a good animation of how they might be floating around, so the circle there is the seasonality, and then the colors are different the speed of currents. So they released all the way from South Georgia. The yellow particles and the blue particles are kind of floating together at the start, but then started drifting away. And we can see a lot of blue particles reach Antarctica from New Zealand from South Georgia. And then eventually they reached Antarctica at the tip of it though. So the idea here is just like the barrier is not unbreakable, and there's more frequent events that happens of species moving around from the north to the south. So a short message here is Antarctica is not as isolated as we thought. So floating objects, including rafts of living marine organisms, can and probably often do reach Antarctica from the northern sources. Another thing we didn't mention about is when kelp, they raft around the Southern Ocean, they also carry a lot of organisms with them. So in the holdfasts, the bottom of the holdfast, it's like a tiny ecosystem themselves. There's so many species like sea stars, crustaceans, or sometimes worms. They are not as, they don't look as good as those, so I didn't draw them. But they are the tiny ecosystem, and when when kelp reach a place, they might reach that place as well. So that can be a problem with climate warming, because Antarctica is very different from rest parts of the world, because a lot of places, because they get warm and species extinct, but for Antarctica, it's actually more species will reach there because they get warmer and they create much more habitats, niche for different organisms. So there's also another paper, kind of also quite recent. They found the invasive bryozoan species on the kelp holdfast that's beached in Antarctica. They are not established yet, so they are not invasive yet, but again, with climate warming, they might become established in the future. So this whole research of all this research kind of leads to my PhD project. One of the biggest objective is how does kelp raft around the Southern Ocean? All the research we've talked about, they are mostly focusing on one kelp species, the Duffy, the rim rapa species, but they also found some other species beached in Antarctica, including the macrocystus, the rimu, giant bladder kelp. They have all these kind of giant bladders help them to float around the ocean, and then they can also travel very large distances and travel all the way from different islands to reach Antarctica. So I will be mainly focusing on this species but doing similar genomic analysis and the modeling with them and see how they might travel around. The second, that's actually the most important message of this whole presentation. If you can help some, collecting some samples or have some trips around the southern hemisphere, like Australia, Chile, or all the sub-Antarctic islands, please contact us because we need more samples and I can't do that just by myself. The second second objective is how does sea ice influence the rafting trajectories of kelp traveling to Antarctica. So oceanographic modeling they did is mainly focusing on Stokes drift and currents, like how the waves helps them to move around. But sea ice is a huge factor around Antarctic Ocean, and especially with warming, there might be more sea ice broken down from the large ice masses, or they might be more melting away around the ocean. So this one is actually a picture of a kelp trapped in sea ice. This one was taken in Arctic, not in Antarctica, but it can happen in the future. And we can think of when the ice they kind of melts away and how the kelp they might raft in a different way than they originally maybe trying to, following the normal currents. So this can be focus of one of the objective. And also there's so many different interactions between sea ice and kelp, and this is what I would be looking into more when I start my PhD. The last objective is could large sub-Antarctic kelp species survive the dark Antarctic winter? So most of the studies we've been talking about, they are mostly focusing on temperature change in the future, but Antarctica, a big factor is they have a very long, dark winter, and they can be cold, they can be dark, and for kelp, they do photosynthesis. So if they can survive, is a huge factor if they can establish in the future. So we will do some lab experiments about this, basically freeze some kelp and don't give them night and see if they can survive or if they can reproduce after a while. Yes, so this would be most of my presentation. The background video is not playing, but the background is actually a very nice beached kelp just nearby a beach where I live. So next time when you go to New Zealand beaches and you see some beached kelp, you can think like they might be come from all the way from South Georgia, sub-Antarctic islands, and you can look at the holdfasts and see all the different animals there and think, oh, in the future where they might end up to. But yeah, it's kind of end of my presentation, and happy to take questions.
Thank you, Pluto. I didn't realize there was raft tours to Antarctica going. Any questions? We have time for one quick question.
I'm going to pinch it. I think you possibly would have said if this was the case, but for the sample that washed up in Antarctica, was there anything in the holdfast?
Yes, so that one, that paper, just go back. So this paper, they find the bryozone species just in the holdfast, and they reached Antarctica. And I think there are some other dead animals, not quite alive ones, but again, in the future, who knows?